Good day. Today is Tuesday, 15th July 2025, and I make this program shortly after the announcement yesterday evening by Donald Trump, the big announcement on Russia that he has been talking about and preparing for, well, about 10 days. And I'm going to say straight away that the announcement, which came in a extremely confusing and I would even go so far as to say chaotic meeting with the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, to my mind, strongly suggested that the decision-making process in Washington continues to be very confused, and that perhaps a decision that had been taken earlier was amended and watered down very significantly in light of pushback from certain forces within the White House and the administration generally. Anyway, before I discuss that rather speculative point on my part, let's actually go to what Donald Trump said. And I should say that it's not fully clear what he did say, but the gist of it was this: the United States apparently does not intend itself to directly transfer further weapons to Ukraine. It's not clear whether some of the weapons that the United States had previously committed itself to providing to Ukraine, that batch of weapons that was in Poland and which was onward bound to Ukraine, the batch that included the 30 Patriot missile interceptors, whether that will now be released to Ukraine or whether it will still only be those 10 missile interceptors that will be supplied to Ukraine, or whether there's been a decision to stop delivery of that batch entirely. But anyway, Donald Trump basically gave the impression that the United States is going to stop direct delivery of weapons to Ukraine. What the United States will instead do is that it will sell weapons to NATO, to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which in turn will supply those weapons to Ukraine. So American weapons are going to continue to be sent to Ukraine, but they're going to be sent to Ukraine through NATO, which will pay for these weapons. Now, there was no word on exactly what weapons the United States would supply to Ukraine in this rather strange, complicated, roundabout way. But the US's ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, made certain comments after Donald Trump's statement, which said that the United States would be selling to NATO for transfer to Ukraine of whatever weapons it could spare. The rest, the weapons that the United States was producing, presumably the weapons that the United States or its priority allies around the world, Israel, Taiwan, for example, well, one imagines from Whitaker's statement, would continue to receive priority. Now, that then brings us back to this very strange arrangement that Trump and Mark Rutte talked about in the Oval Office, in the United States, in the White House yesterday, because this arrangement doesn't make a huge amount of sense, at least to me. First of all, it's worth perhaps saying a little bit about NATO, because, of course, NATO is an alliance of various countries. That alliance has a central secretariat and bureaucracy. Mark Rutte, as the NATO Secretary General, is the head of that bureaucracy. But it is a relatively small bureaucracy that coordinates the work of the alliance. It has never, so far as I'm aware, been on any big scale a weapons procurement operator. What happens in NATO is that the various members of NATO buy the weapons they need themselves. So Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the major NATO powers, Poland as well, they buy their weapons directly, either from their domestic from manufacturers or from each other or from the United States, which of course buys its own weapons from the gigantic, sprawling US military industrial complex. Well, this is not what is apparently going to happen this time. NATO is going to buy the weapons. So does that mean that the NATO Secretariat, the bureaucracy, is going to buy the weapons from the United States? Or is NATO a portmanteau term used by Donald Trump and Mark Rutte to mean the United States' European allies? I presume, in fact, the former. Otherwise, why have Mark Rutte there? But notice that there is no signed agreement, there is no public agreement between the United States and NATO to set up this mechanism, as one would expect that there would be. It's not clear to me that the NATO bureaucracy is currently organized to buy these weapons from the United States. There's no word of any budget being established to buy these weapons from the United States. It's all extremely vague and very unclear. Now, it actually gets more interesting than that, because anybody who knows anything at all about NATO will know that it is overwhelmingly financed by the United States itself. So if NATO's central agencies are buying these weapons, who is going to provide them the funding to do that? The implication of what Donald Trump and Mark Rutte were saying was that the money would be provided by NATO's European members. And in fact, there is word out that there are ongoing discussions in Europe to set up some kind of fund on the part of various European member states, which would fund the weapons purchases that NATO would make to supply the weapons to Ukraine. Well, I say that so far there's no word of the existence of this fund. It hasn't been set up yet. We've not been told about the size of this fund. We're not told how the fund is going to be set up and who the contributors are going to be, or what the supervising facilities are going to be. Of course, if things remain as they are, if the United States continues to provide 70% of the funding to NATO, then presumably the United States will indirectly be paying 70% of the cost of the weapons it sells to NATO to send to Ukraine, in which case the United States will be taking money out of one pocket and putting it in the other. But the overall effect will still be that the United States will be spending money to send weapons to Ukraine. Anyway, it's all very interesting. There is a further dimension to this, of course, which is, of course, that one of the reasons why the Russians launched the special military operation is to prevent Ukraine joining NATO. Donald Trump has previously said that he agrees with this Russian stance, that he understands it, that he too is opposed to Ukraine joining NATO. And yet here we now have a mechanism whereby NATO will supposedly be arming Ukraine. It's difficult to imagine a more provocative arrangement from a Russian point of view. It's surprising to me that in all the oceans of commentary that have been provided about this up to now, no one has said this. No one has commented on this point about this announcement. The Russians will inevitably say, well, if NATO is arming Ukraine, then clearly NATO remains committed to making Ukraine a member of NATO, regardless of what the President of the United States may be saying. And if only for that reason, we have no option but to continue the special military operation, because NATO membership remains an absolute non-negotiable red line for us. Just saying. Then we come back to the question of the weapons that are going to be supplied to Ukraine through this arrangement. And here there is complete confusion. And that confusion, to my mind, actually is concerning, because this is where I think that rather more dramatic plans existed, and after hurried discussions and probable arguments within the US government, those plans appear to have been walked back. Firstly, Donald Trump and Mark Rutte spent a lot of time talking about Patriot missiles and Patriot systems that would be supplied to NATO, to Ukraine, through this rather complex arrangement. Now, that strongly suggests that Patriot missiles continue to be the priority topic. Donald Trump speaks about weapons being sold by the United States to NATO for onward supply to Ukraine, but we have had an accumulation of reports which are impossible to argue against, that NATO stockpiles of Patriot missiles are massively, rather US stockpiles of Patriot missiles are massively run down, and that the United States has, as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently said, the United States has no more of these missiles to spare. The United States instead has been trying to persuade its European allies to part with the Patriot missiles that it has. Now, Donald Trump, over the course of this extraordinary, confusing meeting with Mark Rutte, said that one country has 17 Patriot missile systems ready for onward delivery to Ukraine. Which country is that? I know of only one country in NATO that has as many as 17 complete Patriot missile batteries or brigades or whatever you want to call them. And that country is, of course, the United States. In fact, it has around 50, so I understand. 17 would mean that the United States would be parting with a third of its Patriot missile systems. I cannot believe that at a time when there are already concerns that the stockpile in the United States is running desperately short, that the United States has any real intention to do any such thing. So, which other country has the 17 systems? I know of none. Apparently Germany has 12, but none of them is in good shape. And Boris Pistorius and Friedrich Merz have both said that Germany is now so short of Patriot missiles and Patriot missile launchers that it simply isn't in a position to send any more. Could it be that Donald Trump believes that across Europe there are 17 missile systems, Patriot missile systems, that could be cobbled together and forwarded to Ukraine? That would be an enormous number of Patriot missile systems, and maybe there are that number across the whole of Europe, but that would leave Europe, NATO, critically short of Patriot missile systems at a time when NATO is saying that it needs to increase its forces. So far, no European country that I am aware of has come forward and said that it is prepared to deliver more Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. Could it be that when Trump spoke about Patriot systems, he was meaning something less than complete Patriot missile systems? Systems with all 4, or is it 8 batteries, and with the accompanying radars and all of that? Could it mean that he means launchers, or launch systems, or radars, or individual interceptors? It is all very unclear. So unclear, in fact, that I am increasingly coming round to the view that this package isn't going to provide any or many more Patriot systems to Ukraine. And the reason for that is the one that I have discussed in program after program. The United States is now up to its limits. It cannot supply any more. It cannot produce any more. The Europeans are also short of these systems altogether. As Brian Berletic has been saying for at least 2 years, there is a general shortage, or there was a general shortage of these systems even before the Biden administration back in the spring of 2023 made the decision to start supplying them to Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine has aggravated that shortage, and the 12-day war between Israel and Iran has brought that shortage to crisis. So I don't think that we're going to see many more Patriot missiles or interceptors or batteries or systems being sent to Ukraine. Perhaps somehow, somewhere, a few systems will be pulled together and sent to Ukraine. Plausibly, they will be the older systems which are now becoming superfluous, but which are unable to shoot down the advanced Russian ballistic missiles. And of course, the problem with sending Patriot missiles in any number to Ukraine is that they quickly run out, and then you need more, and more won't come. So, what was the point of this whole plan? Why did Donald Trump come up with this particular plan? Well, I'm going to suggest that there is in fact an answer to this, and this is in a very disturbing article which has appeared in the Washington Post, penned by David Ignatius. Now, David Ignatius is an extremely well-connected and well-informed journalist in Washington. In fact, he is so well-connected and so well-informed that he's widely spoken of as the unofficial voice of the CIA. And that might be true, just to say. Anyway, David Ignatius says that over the course of a telephone conversation, presumably the one that took place on the 4th of July, Donald Trump, angry Donald Trump, having been turned down by Putin in his demands for a ceasefire in the course of that telephone conversation, which took place on the previous day, Friday the 3rd of July. Anyway, according to David Ignatius, an angry Donald Trump asked Zelensky, why don't you hit Moscow? Well, of course, the Ukrainians have made many attempts to hit Moscow. They've sent fleets of drones to strike at Moscow. And some of these drones have reached Moscow and they have disrupted airline traffic in Moscow. But it is fair to say that they haven't ever succeeded in doing much in the way of significant damage. Anyway, Zelensky said to Trump, well, of course we would hit Moscow if you gave us the weapons to do that. And then according to David Ignatius, Trump went away and said that Ukraine must be provided with the long-range missiles in order to be able to hit Moscow. Now, much of my program yesterday centered on the possible delivery of JASSM's air-launched cruise missiles to Ukraine. I pointed out that back in August 2024, the Biden administration appeared to have made a decision to supply these missiles to Ukraine, but it doesn't seem as if that decision then was acted upon. And there was a lot of commentary over the previous days, especially in the British media, that the Trump administration had revisited that decision and had decided to supply JASSM's missiles to Ukraine. And these missiles, if launched by fighter jets, Ukrainian fighter jets, close to the combat line, would just have the range to reach Moscow, though it would be a tight thing. And of course, as I discussed in my program yesterday, it's unlikely that they would be able to make much of an impact in practice. Well, according to David Ignatius, it was an entirely different system that was actually being talked about and which Donald Trump resolved that he would supply to Ukraine, and that is the Tomahawk cruise missile. Now, I discussed the possibility of sending Tomahawk cruise missiles in my program yesterday, but I discounted it. But it turns out, according to David Ignatius, that this is what Trump had in effect decided to do, but he was then subsequently apparently talked out of it or changed his mind. Now, I have to say that there are large parts of David Ignatius's story which I don't believe. I'm not saying he's lying. I'm simply saying that he hasn't been told the complete truth here by his sources. Briefly, I don't believe that it was Donald Trump who on impulse decided to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, allegedly because he was so impressed by how successfully they performed in the strike against Iran. It seems to me much more likely that this was the original plan and that this is what was being discussed by the hardliners in the administration over the last week or 10 days, that they were working to try to get Donald Trump to authorize the supply of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine following the telephone call between Trump and Putin on the 3rd of July, after it became clear that Putin was not going to agree to the ceasefire demand, the demand to freeze the conflict that the hardliners in Washington have been now demanding. And, well, you can see how this debate could have taken place. Of course, I was not part of the debate, so there is a speculative element to it here, but this is, it seems to me, what might have happened, which is that the United States cannot provide Ukraine with large numbers of Patriot missiles because, as discussed in many programs, these are in critically short supply. The United States can supply more ATACMS missiles. Ukraine apparently still has around 18 left from Biden times. They have been used previously. Biden apparently supplied 500 of them. They were used to conduct strikes inside Russia, as happened in the autumn. The problem with the ATACMS is that they're ineffective. The Russian air defenses have repeatedly shown that they are able to shoot them down, and they don't have the range to reach Moscow. The JASSMs are much more advanced, much more modern systems. They might just be able to reach Moscow, but they are also range limited. It's unlikely they would have the ability to conduct a major offensive against Moscow, because Moscow is only just within their range, and the launch aircraft that would have to operate them are in short supply and would be vulnerable to interception by the far more powerful Russian Air Force and Russian air defense systems. So you can't send Tomahawks, JASSMs and ATACMS really won't do, but you do want to somehow even the balance of the war in the sky. You can't shoot down the Russian missiles that are hitting Ukraine, hammering Ukraine night after night, because you don't have the Patriots to do that. So what you do instead is you launch a counter-missile war against Moscow, and you do that with Tomahawk missiles launched from Ukraine, which absolutely do have the range to strike targets in Moscow, and which could, in theory, in fact, reach targets beyond Moscow itself. I believe they could reach targets as far as the Urals. Now, to say that this is a disastrous idea, that it is the most reckless idea, would be a colossal understatement. The first thing to say about supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine is that, of course, these are complex weapons, as all the other systems we've been talking about are complex weapons. It would take many months before they could be brought into a combat position. The bases to launch them would have to be set up. That would have to happen in the face of regular attacks from the Russian Air Force. We've seen that there's a shortage of air defense interceptors, so the launch sites would be vulnerable to attack, and there wouldn't be the interceptors to launch them. So there are already obvious problems about basing Tomahawk missiles in Ukraine. Secondly, if ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadows and all of those need Western technicians and Western technology, specifically American technology, to operate, that is absolutely true also of the Tomahawks. The Tomahawks are the system for which the original terrain guidance technology, as I well remember, was created well back in the 1970s. The United States owns that technology. It would have to make it available for use with the Tomahawks, and to be said straightforwardly, I cannot imagine that the Tomahawks could be launched without the direct involvement of American officials, American military officials. They would have to be there. The technicians would have to be there from the United States. Without them, it can't be done. So the proposal is to launch these long-range missiles to conduct a missile campaign against Moscow from Ukrainian territory using American missiles, American technology, American missiles, American technology, and American personnel and proprietary systems. It would be, in effect, a joint Ukrainian-American campaign to bomb Moscow. Again, it sounds crazy, but it seems to me, close to what it amounts to. Now, a couple of days ago, a story appeared which I basically ignored. One which involved the publication of a recording of Donald Trump telling donors during the 2024 election campaign that he had previously scared off Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine and Xi Jinping from invading Taiwan by telling them that if anything like that happened, he, Trump, presumably as President of the United States, would order the bombing, respectively, of Moscow and Beijing. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I am absolutely sure that no such bizarre conversation with either Putin or Xi Jinping ever took place. Donald Trump has a propensity, in my opinion, a disastrous propensity, to talk puffs, to invent conversations like that. I think it's extraordinarily bad idea, but I think that obviously he invented this conversation to impress the donors during the election. I cannot imagine that he actually said that to Putin and Xi, and of course had he ever done that, one can imagine that their reaction would have been extremely negative indeed, and for that reason I can't imagine that Trump, who wouldn't have known that, would have done a thing of that sort. Now, that then explains to my mind why this recording nonetheless appeared, because somebody within the administration or the permanent government of the United States appears to have been lobbying for exactly this to be done against Moscow, for Moscow in effect to be bombed with Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from Ukraine. Anyway, there is a further twist to this, which takes us further down the line of understanding what a reckless, indeed absolutely crazy scheme this was. Because the Tomahawk cruise missile is a strategic system. It can be used as a tactical system. It in fact is often, it has been exclusively used in this way up to now. It's launched by American warships against ground targets. That's happened in Syria. That's happened in Yemen. That's recently obviously happened in Iran. Tomahawk missiles were also used against Yugoslavia, as I remember, during the 1999 bombing war. And of course, they were used extensively against Iraq. And they've been previously used in other places. They were used to strike targets in Afghanistan and even in Sudan, as I remember, during Bill Clinton's time. But they were originally designed as strategic systems in order to conduct nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union. In fact, a massive controversy in Britain in the late 1970s and early 1980s arose from the fact that Tomahawk cruise missiles equipped with nuclear warheads intended to be used against the Soviet Union were for a certain period of time being forward positioned in Britain at the American base in Greenham Common. So these were, in their origins, strategic missiles, nuclear-capable missiles. Now that means that, of course, they're very well known to the Russians, and the Russians undoubtedly know an awful lot about the properties of these missiles, and that would make it much easier for the Russian air defense system to shoot them down. And I'm confident that if Tomahawk cruise missiles were ever located in Ukraine and were launched against Russia in the way that I have discussed, the Russians would indeed be able to shoot the vast majority of them down. However, given that they are strategic systems, there would always potentially be a question mark about whether they might conceivably be carrying nuclear warheads. Well, probably the Russians would conclude that during the period of the special military operation, whilst they're being used in this tactical way, that was not the case. But then that makes assumptions about what the Russians might think about Tomahawk cruise missiles being launched against their capital. It would be, I think, a foolhardy thing to assume that the Russians would be sure that those missiles only carried conventional warheads. Remember, the military situation in Ukraine is deteriorating by the day, so the Russians might worry, especially given the various threats the Ukrainians have made at various times about nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons capabilities. The Russians might legitimately worry that perhaps at some point, if the situation became desperate enough, desperation can lead to acts of extreme recklessness, and potentially a missile equipped to carry nuclear warheads might even be used in that way. But that is perhaps the most alarmist and unlikely of the problems. The immediate problem relates back to the question of the original reasons for the start of the special military operation. Because amongst the reasons that the Russians launched the special military operation was because they were worried that Ukraine might join NATO, and we now see that NATO is going to play a direct role in arming Ukraine. And as they made clear in various discussions over the course of the winter of 2021-2022 with the Americans, that if Ukraine did join NATO, American long-range missiles might be based in Ukraine. And of course, those missiles, the missiles that the Russians would have been worried about, would, in the first instance, have been nuclear-armed Tomahawk missiles. Eventually, there would have been other much more advanced hypersonic missiles following on as well, but the immediate concern would have been about nuclear-armed Tomahawk missiles. And here we would have a package in which Ukraine would be armed by NATO, the organization the Russians insist Ukraine should not join, and where Ukraine might be launching long-range nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles from its own territory. Again, the recklessness of this is just off the scale. I ought to quickly add, and I owe very much to the careful research of Ray McGovern the former CIA analyst, top CIA analyst, and founding member of VIPS, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Anyway, he's pointed out that one of the key events that led to the start of the special military operation was that over the course of a video call between Putin and Biden in the weeks just before the start of the special military operation, Biden appeared to have given Putin an assurance that whatever happened, the United States would not install long-range missiles capable of hitting targets deep inside Russia in Ukraine. The Russians were relieved and, in fact, euphoric about this, only to have that apparent concession by Biden walked back by Biden's Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in a subsequent conversation that Blinken had with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. Now, McGovern is absolutely right about this. Lavrov has talked about this on many occasions. I've read Lavrov's own comments. Apparently, Blinken struck an extraordinary air of defiance, said that what weapon systems the United States positions in a NATO country, which is to say Ukraine, would be none of Russia's business. The only question would be whether the United States and Russia might agree to limitations on the numbers of missiles, and that might extend to the limitations of the numbers of missiles the United States might forward position in Ukraine. The Russians were alarmed and furious about this, and it was one of the things that decided them to start the special military operation. So here we have a plan, apparent plan, parts of which are now being implemented to arm Ukraine through NATO, the organization that the Russians have said it's a red line for them if Ukraine joins, with ideas floating around Washington for several days and apparently briefly backed by the president himself for Tomahawk missiles to be supplied to Ukraine, medium-range missiles capable of striking at Moscow and apparently intended to strike at Moscow. Now, to say that all of this is alarming simply doesn't come close to telling the truth of it. And thankfully, somebody in Washington seems to have been alive to this implication, the implications of this, because they clearly pushed back. I'm going to guess that the pushback came from the Pentagon, and the whole idea of the Tomahawk missiles was dropped. At the moment, it's not at all clear what additional missiles, long-range offensive missiles, are going to be supplied to Ukraine, if any are, in lieu of the Patriot defensive missiles that the United States is no longer able to supply in any quantity. What this bizarre and extraordinary and indeed deeply alarming episode demonstrates is how reckless and dangerous the situation is becoming, with officials in the United States clearly seeing the writing on the wall for Ukraine. There's actually another article today in the media in the United States which says that officials are saying that Donald Trump himself understands that Ukraine is heading for defeat, that this is the all but inevitable outcome of the war. The only question is whether the Russians can be persuaded in some way to hold back, and that this is what Donald Trump is about. Again, I can't help but think that this is another way of signalling, perhaps to the hardline faction in Washington, we're absolutely not going to go down the road that you suggest, that these ideas to escalate the war in the way that you're proposing with Tomahawk cruise missiles and that kind of thing is beyond dangerous. The war is lost. The only thing left is to see whether we can get the Russians, bring the Russians round to agree to some kind of a deal. And if that can't happen, well, we must start to prepare for the possibility, the probability that sooner or later Ukraine is going to go down to defeat. Anyway, there we are. I think this has been an exceptionally dangerous moment as the balance tilts further and further against Ukraine, as Ukraine's military crisis deepens. We have to be prepared for even more dangerous, more escalatory ideas of this kind circulating. And as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and as many people, other people point out, the worry is that this extraordinary self-discipline and restraint that the Russians have shown in the face of these extreme provocations, the extreme provocations they've had to bear up with up to now, the risk is that some people in Washington of this particularly hardline and reckless type, that this is encouraging them to resort to these extreme steps, which, however, inevitably, at some point, especially if we're going to start seeing Tomahawk missiles launched at Moscow, inevitably is going to provoke a Russian reaction. There comes a point where, however great the restraint is, a response, a strong response from Moscow is going to become inevitable, unavoidable. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the military developments here. On the face of it, many people are seeing the announcement that came out of Washington yesterday as something of a damp squib. And I've said that there are massive uncertainties about it. The proposal is nebulous. There is no plan. There are no structures. It will probably take weeks and months before the necessary structures to buy these weapons and to send them to Ukraine are set up. There are no written agreements in place, and presumably these have to be negotiated and the relevant documents have to be drafted. And, well, I'm not sure that this is a treaty or anything of that kind, but I would be surprised if some people in Congress didn't feel that they ought to at least see what these documents say, given that they amount to weapons deliveries to a party that is engaging in a war. Anyway, so quite likely it will take many weeks and months before anything is set up. Most likely the weapons that will be sent to Ukraine will be sent in dribbles. We've seen that there's a shortage of Patriot air defense interceptors. And as I've said many times, Donald Trump isn't able to magic that problem away. There are shortages of shell production, has not reached anything close to the levels that was planned, let alone would be needed to keep Ukraine fully equipped and supplied with shells. So this announcement yesterday inevitably is going to fall far short of Ukraine's needs. But it doesn't mean that the situation isn't extremely dangerous. The closer we come to the point of eventual crisis on the battlefields, the clearer it becomes that the United States simply doesn't have the supplies to turn the situation round. The more reckless and desperate some people are going to become, and the more likely we are to see dangerous, reckless schemes like the Tomahawk scheme floated out and proposed and conceivably even put into action. Brian Beletic has done a recent program on his channel in which he talks about the fact that even as the United States runs up against its industrial and capability limits, that doesn't mean that it isn't dangerous. He is about this, and I have to say this, absolutely right. And if I have unpacked the events of the last 10 days correctly, and I believe I have, we have all of those reports about the United States being prepared to supply offensive weapons to Ukraine. We've had comments by Donald Trump to that effect as well. We've had that extraordinary leak of the recording of Donald Trump talking about bombing Moscow and Beijing. And we've had the David Ignatius story about the ideas that were floating around of supplying the Tomahawk missiles. So all of this confirms that the situation is indeed every bit as dangerous potentially as Brian Beletic in his program suggested. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. There was the other side to the meeting between Mark Rutte and Donald Trump. And in some ways, it's the one that has attracted the most attention, which is Donald Trump's announcement that Russia has 50 days in which to come to a deal, presumably to freeze the conflict, failing which the United States will impose 100% tariffs on Russia and 100% tariffs on any country that continues to trade with Russia. Now, the first thing to say about this statement is that the Russians have shrugged it off. The Russian stock market actually rose following the announcement. The ruble, which is, by the way, much too strong, and whose strength over the last few months has been causing the Russian government and the Russian economy significant problems and worry. Anyway, the ruble strengthened further. And there's been a string of statements from Russian officials basically discounting the importance of this warning and of this tariff announcement. And a whole procession of Russian officials and MPs, deputies of the Russian Duma and the Federation Council were making comments about it yesterday. But perhaps the most interesting ones come from Medvedev, the head of the the deputy head of the Russian Security Council, of course, former president and former prime minister. He said that Trump issued a theatrical ultimatum to the Kremlin. The world shuddered, expecting the consequences. Belligerent Europe was disappointed. Russia didn't care. That's what he said on his X platform. So that was Medvedev, that the Russians aren't paying much attention. There's been a rather more thought-through response from the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. Lavrov himself is away. He's in Beijing, where he's just had a meeting with Xi Jinping. I'll come to that shortly. But anyway, Ryabkov responded. He said that certainly, above all, we note that any attempts to put forth demands or, moreover, ultimatums are unacceptable to us. Moscow does favour diplomatic resolution of the Ukraine conflict and is ready to negotiate. It is necessary to focus on political and diplomatic work. The president of Russia has repeatedly said that we are ready to negotiate and that the diplomatic path is the one we prefer. However, if this is not met with a proper response, if we cannot reach our set goals through diplomacy, then the special military operation will go on. Moscow is unshakable in its stance. We would like for Washington and NATO in general to treat it with the utmost seriousness. And he did then add that Trump's recent statements do fit in line with the general line we've been seeing from the United States lately. So Ryabkov says that the Russians are aware of this ultimatum, so-called ultimatum, but it's not going to intimidate or deter them or make them change their course. And today, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has also made his own comments. They've been, as always, rather more measured. He says the latest statements from the US president are very serious. Something in them concerns President Putin personally. We will certainly need to time to analyze the rhetoric from Washington. And Peskov said that it's possible that Putin himself might decide to respond directly to these words. But the overall stance and tone from Moscow is that they're going to take the strongest line, that they're going to ignore this ultimatum, that they're going to continue with the special military operation, which continues to be underway. And I have no doubt that that is indeed going to remain the Russian position. Now, here I am going to float my own personal view about this announcement. I don't think Donald Trump wanted to make this. He spoke about Putin in somewhat regretful terms. My clear sense is that he still wants some kind of long-term relationship with Russia, despite apparently giving serious thought to supplying Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles last week. The idea was proposed to him. I'm convinced it was proposed to him rather than that he came up with it. But anyway, he seems to have pulled back from that idea. He's now back to thinking about some kind of long-term deal with Russia. He doesn't seem to be keen on this tariff policy at all. And interestingly, the United States yesterday made known to the European Union that the European Union's attempts to lower the cap on the price of Russian oil ferried by tankers insured in London from $60 to $45 a barrel, with apparently a arrangement that the price for any oil that the Russians sell should be at all times 15% below the market price of oil. Anyway, the administration, United States apparently told the Europeans that it does not support that price cap. So the result is that that part of the existing 18th package of sanctions that the Europeans are laboriously trying to negotiate with each other and to put together in the face of opposition from Slovakia, Hungary, and by the way, Malta, which is of course a major hub of the world's shipping industry. The United States doesn't support the reduction of that cap. Now that, by the way, calls into question the US's real commitment to this tariff policy, these tariff sanctions, if you like to call them that, which Donald Trump spoke about over the course of his meeting, over the course of that meeting with Rutte yesterday. Now, why then is Trump doing this if he doesn't really like this proposal? And I think there is a very, very short answer to this, and a very simple one. In order somehow to see off this sanctions bill that Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal have been navigating through the Senate. Apparently, that bill was almost ready to be put to the Senate floor. Trump has been trying to get that bill watered down in order to give him absolute freedom to impose or waive or adjust tariffs. Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal have been holding back. They've been trying to retain in the bill a provision that Trump's exercise of that power would be subject to congressional oversight. Trump, for obvious reasons, doesn't want that at all. I get the sense that the discussions have become have reached an impasse. The arguments about this have reached an impasse. So Trump has preempted the Lindsey Graham Blumenthal bill by appearing to do the very thing that the bill demands that he do, except of course that he's going to do it exercising his executive authority, and that he's also doing it giving himself, and I stress this is himself, a period of 50 days before these sanctions stroke tariffs come into force. And of course the tariffs in question are $100% tariffs against Russia, a meaningless sanction given that Russia hardly sells anything to the United States anymore except uranium. And of course, it is the United States that wants to buy the uranium from Russia. The Russians could find other buyers for their uranium without much difficulty. The United States is buying uranium from Russia because it needs it. The other tariffs are, of course, the secondary tariffs on countries that are Russian trading partners. And those will be 100% tariffs on those countries in 50 days unless the Russians come to terms in that period of time. Now, Trump and perhaps Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal maybe are gambling that the various countries that trade with Russia will immediately capitulate and will pile on the demands on the Russians over the course of those 50 days to make substantive concessions on the issue of Ukraine. Well, as it happens, the Russians, who've surely known that something like this was coming, they would have known that the Lindsey Graham Blumenthal bill was about to be presented to Congress. And of course, their trade partners would have known about it too, even if they didn't know that Trump would preempt that bill by making this announcement instead. Anyway, the Russians have had meetings now with their two chief allies. To be precise, Lavrov, who is in Beijing, attending the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, has had a meeting with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, but he's also now met with Xi Jinping. And we read that the president of China welcomed the Russian leader's upcoming visit, so Putin is still due to visit Beijing shortly, and underscored that they share a long-standing friendship. Xi Jinping praised the state of bilateral relations and reaffirmed the commitment of China to continue expanding comprehensive partnership and strategic collaboration with the Russian Federation. So it doesn't look as if the Chinese are going to heed this ultimatum. And Lavrov has also met in Beijing with the Foreign Minister of India, Subramaniam Jaishankar, and apparently again it was a relatively friendly meeting. They reiterated their unwavering commitment to further strengthening, I'm taking this from the Russian readout, the further strengthening this multifaceted Russia-India special and privileged strategic partnership at all levels. And the readout does go on to say particular focus was given to the situation around Ukraine and the ongoing developments in the Middle East. So they did discuss Ukraine, but there's no hint here that India is going to stop buying Russian oil either. So what is Trump really seeking to achieve? Because I cannot imagine that he generally believes that China and India, and Turkey and the UAE and all of these other countries, the other BRIC states, are going to stop trading with Russia simply because the Russians don't comply with this ultimatum. Putting aside everything else, all of these countries, none of these countries will want to give the United States power to interfere with their own trading relationships. That is undoubtedly true of China, but it's almost certainly true of India and Brazil, for example, also. And besides, all of these countries probably calculate by now that all of these American threats of further tariffs are a bluff, and to the extent that the Americans are imposing tariffs, they're doing it on them anyway. Brazil has just had a 50% tariff slapped upon it. So why should it not continue to trade with Russia in light of that? Indeed, Brazil is deepening its trade relationships with China, apparently in part in response to that tariff. So why is Donald Trump doing this? Well, I think the short answer is that, as I said, he doesn't want the Lindsey Graham Blumenthal bill presented to the Senate with its provision that Trump's power to adjust tariffs is subject to congressional oversight. So he's trying to kill the bill by preempting it, by imposing tariffs using his executive authority. And for the moment, at least, he's been successful because Senator Toon, the Senate Majority Leader, has now said that because of Trump's decision yesterday, the Lindsey Graham Blumenthal bill has again been put on pause. And that will then give Trump, one supposes, 50 days in which to try to get Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal to water the bill down further, to take away that provision about congressional oversight. So there it is. That is what I think this is all about. Now, let us assume that the Russians follow through with what Medvedev and Ryabkov are saying, and I'm sure they will, and that they continue with a special military operation, and they pay no attention to this ultimatum that they have been handed down. What happens in 50 days? Well, the Americans, Donald Trump, will no doubt impose his 100% tariff on Russia, which, as I said, will make no effective difference. Is he really going to impose 100% tariffs on Russia's trading partners? Well, he's already tried to impose massive tariffs on China. He did that in March, and that led to an all-out trade war between the United States and China throughout March and April. And we've been learning more and more about what happened during that trade war. Firstly, it turns out that all of those reports that Walmart and the others were warning that supplies of finished goods, laptops and that kind of thing were running out, and that the shelves in American shops would empty. It turns out that those reports were probably true. But there was an even bigger crisis, which is that the Chinese retaliated by stopping exports of rare earths. And I remember reading at the time that this in the Financial Times, which covered the topic more fully than any other newspaper, that this was creating havoc across Western supply chains. And we now know that because of shortages of rare earths and magnets, special magnets that apparently only China produces, production lines, key production lines, including in the American automobile industry, were about to shut down. Needless to say, if the United States imposes 100% tariffs like that on China in 50 days' time, the Chinese will take the same retaliatory measures that they did in March and April. I cannot imagine that Donald Trump or the administration or the government of the United States will want to see that happen. And I am sure that one way or another, some kind of carve-out or exemption to China is going to be found, watering down these tariffs so that they really don't much matter anymore. And if the United States cannot enforce these tariffs against China, which is now the biggest buyer of Russian oil and energy products, and which is, by the way, rapidly now emerging as by far Russia's biggest trade partner, what would be the point for the United States of imposing similar tariffs on other countries that trade with Russia? Imagine the effect in India if the United States imposed 100% tariffs on India because India was trading with Russia, even as it did not impose 100% tariffs on China, even though China is also trading with Russia. The Indians would be furious. They, after all, are supposed to be America's friends. They would see the United States granting preferences to China instead of them. I cannot imagine that the United States would make this extraordinary, grotesque decision, which would surely destroy the entire basis of the relationship between the United States and India at this crucial time. And the same is true of Turkey, the UAE, and all of the others. So somehow or other, in some way or other, this sanctions tariff package is going to be mitigated and watered down and stripped of its content. So, a very unsatisfactory situation altogether. It's important to stress that however ineffectual this whole tariff sanctions thing is, we now have that situation starting to crystallize in which US tariff policy, which is supposed to be an economic policy, is now merging with US sanctions policy, which is a geopolitical policy. The neocons are gaining control of the trade policy of the United States. That is going to have massive long-term implications for the future, but it is not going to affect the progress of the conflict in Ukraine. As for the military part of the announcement yesterday, I think far from being complacent, we've probably had a lucky escape. A plan was hatched which could have had disastrous implications. And I'm going to say this to anybody who feels like being complacent. Has there ever been a situation at any point in this conflict when a proposal has been made in the United States to send a weapon system to Ukraine, and when that weapon system was not eventually sent? I don't believe that the United States is going to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. I think there are enough people in Washington who understand the enormous danger of doing that, and I think Donald Trump himself probably does so also. But now that this idea has been broached, I'm afraid I don't think it's going to go away. Anyway, that brings me quickly now to a further roundup of other developments. Keith Kellogg is in Kiev. He is busy meeting Zelensky. Zelensky has been undertaking a massive reorganization of his government. It is very much along the lines I'd anticipated. Shmyhal, the Prime Minister, who is widely considered an able technocrat, is going to take over from Umerov as Defense Minister. It's difficult to see what Shmyhal can bring to the job of Defense Minister. As far as I know, he has a purely civilian background, and I can't really see what he can do to run the Defense Ministry in a time of war. But he is loyal to Zelensky and Yermak, and that's presumably enough. The person who is taking over from him as Prime Minister is apparently a well-known ally of Yermak, and Yermak, it seems to me, is increasingly emerging as the dominant figure now in Kiev, alongside Zelensky himself. Zelensky, of course, has just extended martial law, so he's going to remain president of Ukraine for another 3 months. And the most important part of the reshuffle is that Umerov, the Ukrainian defense minister, is indeed being sent to Washington as ambassador. He, as I said, is going to be replaced by Shmyhal. And the key point is that Umerov was also Ukraine's chief negotiator in Istanbul, and that reinforces my belief that the negotiation in Istanbul is now in effect ended. Peskov today has again said that there seems to be no hurry from the Ukrainians to resume the Istanbul dialogue. Zelensky has openly spoken out against it. My own view is that that dialogue, in effect now, is dead. So that's what I think this is all about. Now, Keith Kellogg, General Kellogg, is in Kiev while all of this is going on. He's going to be there for a full week. I suspect that he's partly there in order to supervise this reshuffle. But I'm going to make a further, rather more speculative guess, and this is a guess. I'm not sure that this is true, but I wonder whether Kellogg was sent to Kiev in anticipation of the decision to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles. He is, after all, the general, or was a general, and presumably he was also sent there in order to coordinate with the Ukrainians, or he might have been sent there to coordinate with the Ukrainians how those Tomahawk missiles would be used. Let me repeat again, I understand that this is speculation. I'm not definitely saying that this is true, but it seems to me a fairly reasonable guess. Now, given that the decision has now been made not to send the Tomahawk missiles, Zelensky, who obviously expected them, was actually telling his officials that he looked forward, that he wanted the war to be taken against Russia, and it looks to me as if he was clearly anticipating the Tomahawk missiles. Anyway, I suspect Zelensky's going to be very disappointed. Kellogg will be there to convey that news. Zelensky will probably be pushing back against Kellogg. But anyway, one way or the other, I suspect that was what that was all about. There are immensely important military developments, and it looks as if the situation around Pokrovsk is now rapidly moving towards its final crisis. There are even some reports that Novoekonomichny, this important village to the east of Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, is about to fall. There's film of Russian troops entering Novoekonomichny from the north, and of course there was film showing them entering Novoekonomichny about a week ago from the south. But there's also reports that the Russians are now pushing westward, and that they are now on the outskirts of Rodinske, this village actually on the main road, supply road, to Pokrovsk itself. But anyway, I'm going to discuss the military aspects of this conflict further in my next program, because to be frank, I feel I'm running out of time. This has been another long video, and I think to discuss the military developments at the tail end of a video like this would not be justified. So this is where I end my program today. Yesterday's announcement may have appeared to be less significant than previous events suggested, but the clues suggest, and the David Ignatius article strongly suggests, that we actually came over the course of the last week to a very dangerous point, and we cannot be complacent or assume that we will not come to such a point again later. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. We are now delivering items all over the world for free, by the way, so that's an option which you can't turned down. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.